afternoon. Welcome to the second presentation in our Faculty and Alumni Showcase Series for the academic year. Today we're really pleased to welcome Sattre and Jill Miller. Katie is a 2007 graduate of the College of Law, where she earned a certificate in Natural Resources, Energy, and Environmental Law. She served as articles editor for the Energy Law Journal during her time here and continues to be active in various programs here at law school. Katie is currently an environmental auditor for one of Ferc. And Jill Miller is an 85 graduate of the University of Missouri School of Law. He has spent most of his career as an in-house attorney at the Williams Companies, Williams Communications, and One Oak. He retired from One Oak as an associate general counsel in 2013 and is in the process of relocating from Tulsa to Springfield, Missouri. To read more about these speakers and to get a schedule of remaining CLEs for the rest of the year, you can just visit our website at utulsa.edu/law/alumni. So please welcome Katie and Jill Miller.
Before we start, we just wanted to make sure to let you know that while we are speaking on regulatory compliance in the energy industry, compliance programs actually span pretty much any industry that the state, federal, or local agencies touch. So that's kind of our little disclaimer before we start. So anytime we talk about the energy industry, you can kind of just insert, healthcare or whatever. So without further ado, there you go. In 2011, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is also known as the Ferc, audited two gas pipeline companies, Chaos Incorporated and Acme Corporation. And they found violations at both companies, and we're going to tell a little bit about their story and what happened.
Anyone who's seen my office would know why I get to represent Chaos Incorporated. Chaos isn't a bad company, but it has some characteristics that are problematic. It's a pipeline company, and Ferc auditors come in and they find 2 moderately serious violations and 20 minor violations. And some of the background on Chaos. They have the minimum compliance plan required by Ferc. That's called a standards of conduct. Requires a pipeline company to maintain a certain amount of distance in terms of information exchange between it and its affiliated marketing company. There's a more general plan purportedly in the files of its regulatory department. And there's an annual email from executives reminding employees that they are to comply with all company policies and all legal requirements. During the investigation, and I think we've all encountered employees like this, one employee basically says, well, we just done what we've always done, and none of us really have any idea what FERC requires. And of course, that's a very helpful kind of statement during an investigation. And it turns out that the general policy is an outdated set of photocopy of FERC regulations. It's a 1987 copy with the even-numbered pages missing that's been in the regulatory file and apparently unreviewed and untouched since 1987. As a result of the, thank you, Katie. As a result of the initial audit, the auditors decide to expand their investigation, and they alert their enforcement personnel. In the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the enforcement division includes the audit personnel, so it's natural for them to alert their colleagues in the enforcement group. And the auditors, or the enforcement attorneys, interview the executives of Chaos. Now, I imagine there are a few less desirable phone calls to make than a lawyer having to call the CEO of a company saying that a federal agency wants to interview you regarding potential violations of federal law. But that's what some attorney had to do there. There's a 5-month investigation, and there's an enforcement proceeding that extends through 2013. It results in a settlement that includes a $1 million penalty and an agreement by Chaos Inc. to develop a real compliance program.
Our next company is Acme Corporation, and while they're not perfect, they are a little bit better than our previous company of Chaos. The Ferc only found one moderately serious violation and 14 minor violations. During the audit, the Ferc auditors found that employees are knowledgeable about Ferc requirements and they know who to ask internally if they have any questions. And it's important to note that Acme has an internal audit group and actually takes the advice very seriously as to what the auditors have to say. They also found that they had knowledgeable employees and a solid compliance program. They had involvement by internal audit groups and compliance attorneys, and they also had training on their compliance program for both employees and contractors, which is very important. As a result, there were only minor changes to their compliance policy. There was only a 2-month investigation. There were no enforcement proceedings, no fines, and the matter was completely and fully resolved within 4 months. Upon learning that one employee was responsible for most of the errors resulting in the violation, they interviewed the employee and his supervisor to find out that since that time, he received a reprimand and probation, as well as additional training, and the supervisor has informally begun having the employees check one another as an audit-type program. The auditors also reviewed the pipeline's compliance policy and made just minor suggestions. They recommended that the Acme incorporate the supervisor's cross-checking into the policy. At the end of the 2-month investigation, the Ferc auditors released a report noting that the errors in Acme's agreement to make recommended changes to its compliance policy. 1 month after Acme submitted its revised compliance policies, the Ferc issued its final order, and it was completely finished. So within a 4-month time period, by 2012, the whole program and audit was completely finished.
These two companies are hypothetical, but based on experience dealing with real companies. When the Ferc auditors come in and they see mistakes, and mistakes are in spite of a solid compliance culture and a solid compliance plan, they tend to be very forgiving, and they tend to work with the company in a constructive manner to resolve the issues on a very informal basis. When Ferc auditors come in and they see something that appears to result from lack of attention or lack of respect, as they may review it, for Ferc regulations, then they tend to give you less slack, and they tend to alert the enforcement group. And when the enforcement group gets involved, if they see serious violations and no compliance plan, no serious effort to prevent those violations in the first place, then that's when you can get into serious enforcement proceedings. Yes?
Forgive this question, which is something of a devil's advocate question. I'm the CEO of Chaos. I get to pay $1 million after 28 years of messing around. Am I economically ahead or behind?
Well, that's a good question. And you might, after the first 27 years, you might have actually been better off doing that. I think in the current Ferc environment, that if you look going forward, you're better off economically even just from a pure cost-benefit perspective, to have a good compliance program in place. Because the Ferc attitude toward enforcement is a lot stricter now than it was in the 1980s. So, but yeah, that's a good point. And we'll get back to that cost-benefit issue later. Yes?
How prescriptive does the program have to be, the compliance program, and does it require a Ferc review in advance and approval or anything like that?
There's no requirement that Ferc review it. Ferc will probably answer some very specific questions about it. In the course of an audit, they would probably give you a lot of feedback on it. I don't think they will review an entire plan if it's not in an audit. In terms of how prescriptive it needs to be, I think it needs to be prescriptive in terms of assigning responsibilities and deadlines and so forth. If you say thou shalt, but you don't say who shalt, then it's probably not prescriptive enough. You have any thoughts on that? Okay. And this gets into the cost-benefit issue somewhat. And I just highlighted a couple of orders that a couple of settlements have taken place in 2013. The first was with Barclays Bank and some of its traders. And together, they had to cough up almost $500 million in a settlement for manipulating electric energy prices in the western United States during 2006 to 2008. Most of that was in the form of penalties. Some of it was in the form of disgorgement of profits. And you can see here the profits that they earned were about $35 million, and the fine was a little over $450 million. So, at least in this case, is very unprofitable to have engaged in the market manipulation. The second order resulted in a much lower fine and much lower disgorgement, but of course $1.5 million for most companies is enough to get their attention. It also involved West Coast manipulation of energy prices and involved the bank also, Deutsche Bank. A survey of 46 business leaders at 46 multinational corporations concluded that the cost of non-compliance far outweighs the cost of maintaining compliance. And the findings on average showed a cost of $9.4 million annually for compliance failures, which far outweighed the $3.5 million annual cost of maintaining compliance. So at least in that informal survey, there's a belief among multinational corporations that it is less expensive to comply than it is to not comply. And the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has made it a mission to ensure that those that have violated the law don't gain by having done so. So if it finds at least an intentional violation, then it has an economic model that actually uses to ensure that the violator was not better off. For example, if it saved $10 million by failing to implement something to improve air quality, then they would make sure that it not only paid that $10 million cost, but the interest of that cost over the term between the time of that it was required to install the equipment and the time that it would assess the violation. And those of you who are familiar with game theory, this is maybe what you're thinking about. If just thinking in terms of pure game theory, a regulatory agency is generally not going to want violators to think in terms of, I am better off violating the law, I'm better off speeding, for example, and paying the occasional ticket just as a price of doing business. And I can't speak for the motor transit industry, but I suspect that's the case in that industry, that it may actually be more profitable to pay the ticket. But at least at Ferc, and I think at many other agencies, they are taking steps to make sure that it is not profitable to violate the law.
Another issue is that non-compliance can be customer relations as well as public relations issues, so bad press. We've all heard about the various companies that have had incidences in the news, and you kind of think negatively about them. So customers and investors can lose confidence in the company's integrity. They may have to undo deals because customers no longer want to deal with them. May appear unsophisticated and unreliable, and just overall a poor public image as a result of an investigation or an incident. With respect to compliance programs, agencies don't generally mandate the adoption of compliance programs, and I do stress generally in that it kind of depends on the regulation, but generally is the key term here. In assessing penalties, however, in this case, the Ferc will look to whether an existing compliance program focuses on the role of senior management in fostering compliance, effective preventative measures to ensure compliance, prompt detection, cessation, and reporting of violations, and any remediation efforts. From the Ferc's perspective, a well-designed compliance program should be formally structured and organized and independent. Such a program should also regularly assess risk, include a reporting process with direct linkages to senior management, and provide adequate training for employees and contractors at all levels. Robust internal compliance programs are usually the first line of defense in ensuring compliance with Commission's statutes, orders, rules, tariffs, and regulations. Consistent with the Commission's strategic goal of promoting internal compliance, the Division of Audit, which is what Ferc's audit group is called, has continued to review company compliance programs and provide informal feedback and recommendations on most directed audits. So rather than to wait for the DA to conduct an audit and provide feedback on their compliance program, many companies have circumvented that process and went ahead and developed a compliance program, and they continue to conduct their own internal audits with respect to the various regulations.
Continuing to look at compliance programs from the Ferc perspective, they believe that one result of an effective compliance program would be that it obligates employees to abide by all requirements, including internal company requirements, and that they would make it more likely that employees follow the spirit of regulations, not just the literal interpretation. And finally, to quote, an effective compliance program would result in effective internal oversight, accountability, transparency, and increased performance and compliance throughout the company. One of FERC's long-term compliance goals is to have 70% of the company compliance programs that it looks at found to be adequate to demonstrate a culture of compliance. Now, this is a little strange because FERC doesn't require that companies adopt compliance programs. And the fact that companies have been audited doesn't mean they've done anything wrong. So they expect that you will have compliance programs, even though they do not require that you have them. And as it says, they think their target for this fiscal year is that 70% of companies will have such programs.
So I'm sure the burning question in everybody's minds is, now that we're here, what can we do? So it's important you can work with clients to establish a compliance program, work with them, know the regulations, help actually draft and write their programs. You can help create compliance training programs or review their existing programs for any deficiencies or to make it a more robust program. One important thing that I did when I was in private practice, I held a lunch and learn similar to this, where I would bring in several of my clients and we would discuss one or two important regulations. I'd feed them lunch, they would get a free hour with an attorney, we would talk about the regulation and see if they had any questions about general compliance. We talk about establishing a compliance program for them and possible training for employees. And then I always made sure to include the risk of non-compliance, because that's what will get them to call you back.
Of course, that something similar to that can work for those of you who are in-house attorneys as well.
Some different opportunities where you might be able to work with clients. You may be in-house, or you may work with the in-house legal department. In private practice, where you may invite current clients, that's a great area where you can maybe increase your business if you want to get into a different segment, include healthcare or DOT, Department of Transportation, not just perhaps something with respect to energy. You can work with auditors. You can do internal audit, state, local, federal agencies. For those of you that may be law students, all of these areas are some possible areas of employment for you when you graduate from law school as well. And kind of a last group would be a regulatory department. Within a various companies, they might do rates and regulatory. There's also significant growth in practice, especially in the energy sector, especially in this part of the country, in this region, in Tulsa, in fact. There are various client training presentations where you can provide free compliance training or assistance, like the Lunch and Learns. It's an excellent way for private practice attorneys to establish or build on your client relationships. They really think that you are taking the time to help them and care about them, and that you want to help them absolve problems before they even maybe arise. Compliance work can lead to other types of representation, because now you've built a rapport with them, you've helped write their compliance programs, you've been working with them. So in the event that there's litigation, hopefully not with your compliance program, but sometimes there are audits and other business transactions, they're more likely to call you because they have already worked with you and have a rapport with you. And in order to help further your training, there are various entities hold compliance forums and summits to educate. For example, the Ferc, various state and federal agencies such as the Department of Homeland Security, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality, and those kinds. There's also trade associations such as INGA and the AGA, as well as American Conference Institute.
And we've primarily been talking about the need for developing a compliance program. Are there any questions so far? Okay. What we'd like to talk about now is developing a compliance program. And there are many ways of going about it, and having done this, it can seem like an overwhelming task, and it's definitely something that you need to break into various stages, or you will feel overwhelmed by it. The first thing to do, somewhat obviously, is identify all of the obligations that you have. And at one company, we were very new to an industry. I actually went through the Code of Federal Regulations, and I actually found some regulations that nobody was complying with. Even EMCIs of the world, it was in telecommunications. And by the way, only one of the 3 companies that I've worked with has gone bankrupt, so get that off my chest. Identify those. Code of Federal Regulations is one source. Sometimes you have, and particularly with Ferc, you have things that aren't codified. They're just in Ferc orders, but you still have to comply with them. So may have to go through some of the Ferc orders. Fortunately for Ferc, they have a list of their landmark orders on their website, and that will have most of those kind of requirements, such as the requirements for pipelines extending credit and things like that. There can even be for some companies, court orders. AT&T, for example, and its former subsidiaries operated for years under a consent decree that was managed by the D.C. District Court. Then you need to communicate with internal groups, and this is very important. Instead of taking the view that you go to internal groups and say, you need to be doing this, you need to be doing this, you need to find out what they're doing. And sometimes you'll be surprised, they're already taking care of the issue. They may have very well documented procedures that you can, maybe in your overall compliance plan, simply refer to. They may have very good undocumented procedures that are vulnerable if a key person retires. And in that case, of course, it'd be great to document those and talk with that individual so that you can incorporate those into the company's knowledge pool rather than just relying on that one individual. Also, by talking with people, you give them the sense, and the sense based in reality, that you're not trying to impose something on them without considering their feelings and their knowledge and what they've already done. There may be some groups that you would think would naturally do something. They might think that accounting should fulfill one obligation, when it turns out that it's actually accounts receivable that does that particular role. So it's important to communicate with the internal groups. And for an outside attorney working with the company, it's you're going to have to do a lot of work to understand the company. It might be good to have an ally within the company, sort of a point person that can direct you to different people. At some point, you're going to have to assign responsibility. You asked how prescriptive the plan needs to be. It needs to be very prescriptive in terms of somebody looking at it, being able to say, okay, this position, this individual, and it's not an individual by name typically, it's an individual by position, either did this or failed to do it. Because if you don't do that, if you say this department's going to do it, and there's nobody in particular responsible for it, then it may or may not get done, and you don't have any way of saying, so-and-so failed to do this, and then going to their supervisor and getting pressure on them to get it done. So you really need to have responsibilities and accountability. To make the program effective, you need to make the obligations very clear as possible for the other groups, and if possible, easy. For example, if you need information from a group and you need it in a certain format, give them the format. If you just need 3 numbers from a group and you can do the math yourself to create the other numbers that are required, you might just ask them for those 3 numbers and do the work yourself. You need to document your procedures. The procedures have to be documented to the extent that someone outside the company could come in and review them and understand what was going on, as well as someone in the company. And then you need to obtain buy-ins from internal groups and upper management, as well as the formal approval. And hopefully, if you've done the internal communication properly, it'll be easier to obtain the buy-in from the internal groups. Upper management, you may have to do sort of a version of what we did in the first part of our presentation to sell them on the need for a compliance plan. On the other hand, a lot of upper management have been attending forums where they understand that compliance in the broader scheme, compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley Act, compliance more generally is very, very important. So they may be more than willing to buy in. But so instead of just a signature, you really need their commitment to the program.
Another thing to keep in mind when you're developing your compliance program and working with a company, is that the folks that are probably going to be actually having to do the compliance work are not attorneys. So when you're drafting the language, stay away from, legalese, make it as simple as possible for them to understand what it is that they need to do, because the most well-drafted, beautifully, eloquently written compliance program, if no one can understand it, isn't any benefit to anyone in that respect either.
And, the people that are fulfilling the compliance obligations mostly are going to have many other things to do. So this is an additional requirement for them. Oftentimes, a company in adopting a compliance program will find that they need to add additional personnel. And it's difficult to say how many additional people you're going to need. Often you'll need one person whose job is to monitor the compliance program, to see how it's doing, to see if people are meeting their deadlines, to issue reminders, to see that if someone hasn't met their deadline, if that person maybe has left the company or is on leave or something. Any questions so far? To have an effective compliance plan, you need to implement a reminder and monitoring system with consequences for noncompliance. And the reminder system can be as simple as something that's based on Outlook or some similar email and calendaring system. If you have a litigation calendar system, you'll probably be able to adapt that to this. For example, there may be a need to file a quarterly report, or you may have decided that you want to check internally on a quarterly basis. So you'll need a quarterly reminder, and maybe you'll want 5 individuals in the company to report back on a quarterly basis. One way of doing that would be to set up the emails so that they go out automatically. Another way would be to have the compliance coordinator, if you have that position, get a reminder and have them just manually send out the emails quarterly. And there need to be consequences for noncompliance. The first consequence, if somebody misses a deadline, and you need to build in enough time so that if somebody misses the deadline, the world doesn't end. That they have time to meet the deadline, or somebody else can come in and meet it, even if they miss it. The first consequence just might be a nice reminder email, and if they don't do that, then maybe a phone call. If you don't get a response, then maybe you call their supervisor, and and so on. And maybe you have to escalate by calling their vice president of their unit or whatever. With a smaller company, it might just be repeated calls to the same person. But there need to be consequences, either reminders or making it somewhat painful for the person who's failed to do what they need to do. You need to provide training. The training needs to be at the initial point, both to train on the program and the need for the program to help with the buy-in. And you need, of course, substantive training. And one way of providing training, which is often very effective, and I've seen it used at different companies, is to provide the training either live or via video. You could even provide it in a low-tech manner, just using handouts. But then you test on the training, and people have to pass by a certain score, or they have to retake the training. And if they don't pass, then they retake it, and they just have to keep retaking it until they pass. And I believe that everybody, in my experience, has passed after 3 times, and most people will pass the first time. And most employees, they're a little competitive. They want to do well on the training, so that makes them pay attention while they're taking the training. And of course, the fact that they have to pass the test is useful if someone comes in and says, well, how do you know your training is effective? Well, look, we had all our employees take it, and they had to keep taking it, until they achieved a certain degree of knowledge with the training. And of course, you should document your training. You should regularly review the effectiveness of the program. It's not something that a company can just adopt and then forget about. I've often seen the compliance program development as a sort of a circle where you develop it, implement it, assess it, and then revise it. And you're going to have to do that all the time. For one thing, you're going to make mistakes in setting up the program. You're going to be things you could have done better. Second, you're going to find out new things, maybe best practices at a trade forum. Maybe there's going to be something in an agency pronouncement that gives you an idea on how to deal with something. Secondly, the laws change. You have to deal with changes in the law or even in interpretations of the law. And companies change. You may have new legal requirements, or you may have requirements that no longer apply to the company. So for all those reasons, but mainly just to make sure that it continues to be effective, you need to reassess the compliance program regularly. And I've listed some sources of additional information. It may seem strange that I've listed the Federal Highway Administration, but it actually has a pretty good generic compliance program that you could take out highway and put in some other industry, and it would work pretty well. The New York State Office of Medicaid Inspector General, even a stranger choice, it has a form that is useful for assessing how effective a compliance program is. And finally, more relevant to the energy industry, the NERC compliance program from the LA Department of Water and Power. And NERC, for those not familiar with it, is the sort of energy, it's the electrical energy regulator that sort of sits between the power companies and the Ferc. Okay. If there are any power attorneys in here, I hope you'll forgive the oversimplification.
Any questions?
In your experience, kind of going back to the beginning of your presentation, once Chaos Company or whatever company has been flagged for violating compliance programs, are they on the radar screen for, like, are they under probation for a certain amount of time, and are they going to be regularly reviewed after that, or after the process is completed, are they just as likely as any other company to get inspected? What's your experience on that?
That's a good question, and probably a component of their compliance program is that they need to report to FERC maybe a year later on what's happened. So in a sense, they'll probably be on probation for a period. In terms of whether they're going to be re-audited more quickly, frankly, looking at the pattern of FERC audits, it's hard to detect any pattern. So I don't know. But there usually is some sort of, if you will, probationary period where they are forced to provide some feedback. How many of you are in the energy industry? Okay.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much for your time. If any of you have any individual questions, feel free to come up. The slide that has the links on it, I'd be glad to email that to anybody that will give me their email address. And if you want to avoid typing all that information out. Again, thank you very much.